17. The Lost Expedition of Gene Clark. In later years, toward the end, he would have really bad nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. Kai Clark, Gene Clark's son. In many ways, the Gene Clark story reads a lot like the Graham Parsons story. Both were considered by their peers to be among Laurel Canyon's brightest stars, yet both are now largely forgotten. Both of their lives were cut tragically short, though Clark lived considerably longer than Parsons. Both of their deaths were overshadowed to some extent by unusual events that occurred just after their passing. Both were considered pioneers of the country rock genre. Both played for a time with the Byrds. Both recorded duets with Emmylou Harris, and both employed many of the same musicians on their various solo projects. Both had legions of female admirers. Both had a keen interest in UFOs and believed in alien visitations. And both were notorious drug and alcohol abusers. Harold Eugene Clark was born on November 17, 1944, in Tipton, Missouri, though the year of his birth was frequently reported as 1941. It seems quite likely that Gene Clark himself was the source of that erroneous biographical detail, to avoid questions about the fact that his alleged father was actually overseas for all of 1944. WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON 188. Tipton is a small town, the kind of town where everyone knows one another by name. In fact, Tipton is kind of like a big park, where the same oversized family reunion is held every day of the year. As Bonnie Clark Label told author John Einarsson, "When I was in Tipton, Missouri, the year my grandfather died, in 1954, I found out I was related to almost everyone in the community. Everyone had married people they knew through the various families like Fayette and Sommerhauser. I couldn't throw a stone without hitting a family member." Tipton was founded by Mr. William Tipton Seeley, a rather wealthy and influential gent who opened a general store circa 1830. A community soon sprang up around his store, as tended to happen in those days, and Seeley named his new little fiefdom Round Hill. A decade or so later, in the 1840s, a group of German immigrant families arrived in the area: the Neufers, the Lutzes, the Kamericks, the Schmidts, the Hones, the Schrecks and the Sommerhausers. Those families proceeded to intermarry to a rather extreme degree. In the 1850s, Seeley lobbied hard to have both the Pacific Railroad and the Butterfield Overland Mail route pass through his little kingdom. Those efforts proved successful, though the railroad was routed a few miles north of Round Hill. Around that new railroad station was born Seeley's second town, tiny Tipton, where Gene Clark would spend the early years of his life. Meanwhile, just before 1800, a group of Irish families led by a Mr. Edmund Fayette settled in southwestern Illinois. In addition to the Fayettes, the group included the Whelans, the Aharas and the O'Neills. These families also proceeded to intermarry. Some factions of the family eventually crossed over the border into Perryville, Missouri, where they became slave owners. James and Helena Fayette split from the rest of the Missouri herd and moved to Cole Camp, not too far southwest of Tipton. According to chronicler Einarsson, the move was recommended by a priest who feared too much inbreeding among the families. Oscar Fayette, Gene Clark's maternal grandfather, was born and raised near Tipton, as was the woman who was to be his wife and Gene's grandmother, Rosemary Sommerhauser. Before long, the Fayettes and the Sommerhausers were intermarrying at a furious pace. According to Bonnie Clark, the Fayette and Sommerhauser families had double cousins going on. On the summer solstice of 1920, Rosemary Sommer, David M. C. Gowan, 189. Hauser Fayette gave birth to Mary Jean Fayette, Gene Clark's mother. After completing elementary school, Mary Jean was sent away to work as a domestic servant for an unnamed wealthy family living near Kansas City, Kansas. The Depression years were pretty rough, from what I hear, but selling off your barely teenage daughter seems a bit harsh. The other half of Gene Clark's family tree is, curiously enough, shrouded in mystery and secrecy. As chronicler Einarsson notes, unlike Gene Fahey Clark's well-documented family history, the lineage of Gene's father, Kelly George Clark, is far more murky and mysterious. Indeed, Einarsson's extensive research turned up little more than the fact that Kelly Clark was born on November 11, 1918, in Lenexa, Kansas, and that, according to family law, there might be Native American blood in the family tree that has been concealed. Or maybe Pop Clark's history is murky for other reasons. What is known is that Kelly Clark apparently quit high school and went to work for the Parks Department as a groundskeeper. While tending the grounds at the Milburn Country Club, he met young Gene Fahey, who apparently was taken there fairly frequently by her employers, because most wealthy people, it seems reasonable to conclude, take their young servants with them to the country club. After a relatively brief courtship, the two married on May 29, 1941, and promptly started a family. Bonnie Clark was born on March 13, 1942, just over 9 months after the couple exchanged vows. Kelly Catherine was to be the couple's second child, but she was, alas, reportedly stillborn on the summer solstice of 1943. Nothing suspicious about that. Nor about the peculiar fact that, while Gene and other members of the family would be laid to rest in the Sommerhauser family plot at St. Andrew's Cemetery in Tipton, Kelly Catherine's is a solitary stone at the far south end of the cemetery, as recounted by John Einarsson in Mr. Tambourine Man. A few months after Kelly Catherine Clark's curious death, Kelly George Clark was called up for radio and gunnery school. Following training, he was assigned to a unit that served as General George Patton's mop-up crew. Clark's team landed at Le Havre, France, and steadily made their way towards Germany. By May of 1945, immediately following the fall of the Third Reich, Clark was in Berlin. Meanwhile, the third Clark child, Gene, was born in November 1944. Officially, Gene Clark was impreg. WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON 190. Nate, while her husband was briefly home on leave, presumably in February in 1944, though it seems very unlikely that he would have been at home at that time. In any event, Gene spent the first years of his life in a house at 304 Morgan Street, directly across the street from a funeral home. Kelly Clark returned home at the end of World War II and promptly impreg Nate, his wife once again. Nancy Patricia Clark was born on July 19, 1946. The family would continue to grow until there were no fewer than 10 Clark siblings, all living in a tiny house far off the beaten path. As a former classmate and friend told Einarsson, "You had to take a dirt road up, and it was the only house back in the woods, way up high. I couldn't believe the first time Gene took me there. It was kind of spooky in a way." As Sister Bonnie has acknowledged, the Clarks were known as a very strange family in the community. That may have had something to do with the family's rather unusual choice of recreational activities, such as throwing knives at laundry detergent boxes. Gene was very good at it. "We both were. This was one of the things we did as a family function," noted Bonnie. Gene would have a lifelong fascination with knives and guns. According to friend Joe Larson, after Clark began making money with the Byrds, he started buying guns. In the cover photo for one of Gene's solo albums, he is sitting on a picnic table. As brother Rick Clark has noted, there are bullet holes in the table where we would shoot at cans and bottles from the back porch with Gene's guns. One of those guns was an antique rifle given to Gene by fellow gun aficionado David Crosby. Apparently a lot of those peacenik hippie types in Laurel Canyon were packing heat. Shockingly enough, most of the members of that strange family living in the backwoods did not fare so well as they grew into adulthood. As of the time of the writing of Einarsson's Mr. Tambourine Man, 2005. One Clark sibling had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, and other suffered from severe bouts of clinical depression. Another was homeless due to untreated mental illness. Another was on psychiatric meds most of her life, before dying suddenly in 1987. Another was bipolar. And yet another was diagnosed with severe mental retardation. Even more shockingly, mysterious Father Kelly Clark was said to be a raging alcoholic who suffered from severe mood swings. David M. C. Gowan. 191. Jean's formal education began in 1949 at a strict Catholic school in Raytown. According to Big Sister Bonnie, quoted by Einarsson, there were truly some abusive people there. I can remember some of those nuns being real nightmares. By 1960, the family had moved to Borner Springs, Kansas, where Jean attended high school. He was known to hang with a rough crowd during his high school days, and a few of his buddies from those years ended up serving prison time. On August 12, 1963, Jean Clark, still a few months shy of his 19th birthday, was inexplicably offered a spot in the new Christy Minstrels vocal group. He was on a plane to California the very next day. The Minstrels were a very busy touring group, averaging some 300 dates a year, so Jean would spend a lot of time on airplanes during his 6-month tenure as a minstrel. Curiously though, fear of flying would be cited a couple years later as Jean's reason for leaving the Byrds. One of the gigs the group played, on January 14, 1964, was at the White House as special guests of Lyndon Johnson, who had taken office less than 2 months earlier following the assassination of John Kennedy. After the performance, Jean and other minstrels, including Barry Maguire, who, as was discussed previously, released Eve of Destruction a couple years later, went out on the town and partied with Johnson's 2 daughters, Linda Bird and Lucy Baines, who were just 19 and 16 at the time. As the story goes, Jean quit the New Christy Minstrels a couple of weeks later, in February of 1964, after hearing the first album released by an upstart British band known as the Beatles. Clark immediately headed out to Los Angeles, as would so many others, where he regularly hung out at the Troubadour, just off the Sunset Strip. It was there that he met one James Joseph McGinn III, who had, curiously enough, once been in the New Christy Minstrels himself, for exactly 1 day. The two quickly formed a folk duo and began writing songs, hoping to soon get bookings at the Troubadour and other local clubs. But according to McGinn, the pair never got to the stage of performing as a duo. Crosby came along quite quickly. McGinn was initially quite wary of the interloper, but the three nevertheless became a trio known at first as the Jet Set. With Crosby, of course, came Jim Dixon, who would transform the trio into the Byrds. According to Vern Gostin, who, along with his brother, Rex, played WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON. 192. With many of the Laurel Canyon musicians, it was Jim Dixon who put the Byrds together, you might say. If I'm telling the truth, this is what I think. I don't think the Byrds had any ideas whatsoever, and Jim Dixon put it all together for them. Dixon originally envisioned the band as a Beatles Q quartet, with Gene as John, lead vocalist, a rhythm guitarist, Roger as George, lead guitar and vocals, and Crosby as Paul, bass and vocals. This arrangement proved unworkable, however, since Crosby was reportedly unable to sing and play bass at the same time. This then led Dixon to recruit mandolin player Chris Hillman to take over bass duties, leaving Crosby with little to do other than provide harmony vocals. That didn't sit well though with Lord Crosby, so he began a relentless campaign aimed at eroding Gene's confidence in his own guitar playing ability. Crosby's constant ridicule paid off, and he soon enough took over rhythm guitar duties. The five-man band was then complete. Gene would provide most lead vocals and bang the tambourine. Jim or Roger McGinn would provide the band's signature 12-string guitar sound and harmony vocals. Crosby would provide serviceable, at best, rhythm guitar work and harmony vocals. And Chris Hillman and Michael Clarke would pretend, initially at least, to play the bass guitar and the drums. The band released its first single as the Beefeaters. The record was produced by Jim Dixon, who would go on to guide the Byrds' career, and Paul Rothchild, who would go on to guide the Doors' career. The single, released by Elektra Records, went nowhere. By November of 1964 though, the band, renamed the Byrds, was signed with Columbia Records. Just 2 months later they would record Mr. Tambourine Man and become huge stars. But there was a hurdle to overcome first. As E.I. Narson notes, Gene had received his draft notice. Roger and Michael had already dodged that bullet, now it was Gene's turn. Not to worry, though, Gene was able to dodge that bullet as well. According to Einar Son, Gene was deemed unfit for military service due to an old football disease, identified as Osgood-Schlatter's disease. Luckily for Gene, it apparently didn't prevent him from playing football, but it did keep him out of the service. Gene Clarke was, without question, an astoundingly prolific songwriter. Relatively few of his compositions, however, appeared on Byrds. David M. C. Gowan. 193 albums, which instead featured a lot of covers. The truth is that Gene had more than enough songs, and reportedly good songs, to fill the early Byrds albums. Even Crosby has acknowledged that Clarke was prolific. He would show up every week with new songs and they were great songs. Crosby wasn't so generous, though, with his assessments of Gene's talents back in the day. According to most accounts, it was the jealousy of Crosby and McGinn that kept Gene's tracks off the records. In those days, there wasn't a lot of money to be made by performing and recording music. The real money was in song royalties, so Clarke was paid considerably more than the rest of the band. As McGinn put it, Gene was into Ferraris and we were still starving. That disproportionate compensation quickly drove a wedge between Clarke and the other two-thirds of the original trio. At times, Gene even shared writing credits on his songs just to get them onto albums. The classic 8 Miles High, for example, was written by Gene but credited to Crosby and McGinn as well. As has been noted previously, Vito Polikas played a key role in launching the careers of the Byrds. And so it is that we find references to Vito and his entourage in Einarson's telling of the Gene Clarke story. Vito and Carl were legendary hipsters on the LA scene and were into LSD long before anyone else. It was at their studio that Gene believed the Byrds truly found their magic as a group. According to Morgan Cavett, the son of Oscar-winning screenwriter Frank Cavett, they had this group of hippies before that term came into use. Somehow they had hooked up with the Byrds. When the band launched its very first national tour in July 1965, along for the trip were LA scene makers Vito and Carl and their entourage of crazed hippie dancers, whose uninhibited gyrations caused quite a stir in the heartlands of America. Einarson's account, though, is not quite accurate. Vito stayed home while First Lieutenant Carl Franzoni led the faction of the troupe that hit the road with the Byrds. Assisting Franzoni was Byrds' roadie Brian McLean, who shortly thereafter would beat out Mansonite Bobby Beausoleil for the rhythm guitarist position in Love. As troupe dancer Lizzie Donahue would later recall, many of those in America's hinterlands thought we were from outer space. In Paris, Illinois, they actually threw us off the dance floor. Gene Clarke would later remember that the band could have played out of tune all. WERDSCENSIDETHECANYON 194 Day. Nobody ever heard us anyway. According to many accounts, the band oftentimes did play out of tune all day. And all night as well. When the band followed up its first national tour with a tour of the UK, the Byrds were not well received. Often the band would spend more time tuning their instruments between songs than they did actor ally playing those songs. And by most accounts, the boys made virtually no attempt to forge a connection with the audience. Gene did though forge a bond with the Rolling Stones' Brian Jones, whose life would be tragically cut short a couple years later. Sometime after that tour, members of the Byrds famously met with members of the Beatles and they all dropped acid together. Some AC accounts hold that meeting took place in the Cielo drive home where Sharon Tate would later be butchered, but it appears to have actually taken place at another home in Benedict Canyon, one that may have been formerly owned by Jar Jar Gabba. Laurel Canyon stalwart Peter Fonda was reportedly in attendance, and legend holds that it was he who supplied a very high John Lennon with the line, "I know what it's like to be dead." In March of 1966, a press release announced Gene Clark's departure from the Byrds. McGinn has alleged that Dixon and co-manager Ed Tickner encouraged Gene to split from the band so that they could exploit his solo potential. If so, then they must have been greatly disappointed since Clark never came close to living up to that potential. One of the first offers Gene received upon his departure from the Byrds was from drummer Dewey Martin, who invited Clark to join the newly formed Buffalo Springfield. Clark declined, choosing to form his own band, the first of which was dubbed The Group. As Einarsson explains, 6 weeks after rehearsals began, Gene Clark and the group debuted at the Whiskey A Go-Go on June 22 for a 2-week stand on the heels of a dazzling 6-week stint by new group Buffalo Springfield. Around that same time, Clark began having an affair with Michelle Phillips, who lived with hubby John Phillips just a couple of blocks down the canyon. Following what were reportedly unproductive recording sessions, Gene's first post-Byrds formation broke up. On July 10, he was signed as a solo artist and he entered the studio the next month accompanied by doomed guitarist Clarence White, Brian Wilson collaborator Van Dyke, David M. C. Gowan. 195. Parks, our old friend Glenn Campbell, the ubiquitous Chris Hillman, and Vern and Rex Gostin, who had gotten their start alongside Chris Hillman in the formation known as the Hillmen. In January of 1967, Clark's first solo album was released as Gene Clark with the Gostin Brothers. Like many of the other records we have stumbled upon while on this journey, some fans and critics regard the record as the first country rock album, released a year and a half before the country rock forays by the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield. The album, unfortunately, was quickly overshadowed by the Byrds' own Younger Than Yesterday, which Columbia released just 2 weeks after releasing Gene's solo effort. By March of 1967, Clark had put together a new version of the group, which debuted at the Whiskey with Clark, Clarence White, and 2 members of the Mamas and the Papas touring group, whom Gene had met through his paramour, Michelle Phillips. At the tail end of 1967, Gene briefly rejoined the Byrds, replacing the fired David Crosby. The reunion lasted only a few weeks, but it was long enough for Gene to contribute to the notorious Byrd Brothers, released in January 1968. When Gene had left the Byrds, it should be noted, he had done so empty-handed. Not so with Crosby, who was given a substantial settlement upon his departure. He used that money to purchase a yacht, which he dubbed the Mayan. Crosby thereafter was known to spend extended periods of time aboard the Mayan, sailing to and from various locations. He was not the only canyon musician to own and operate such a vessel. John Phillips had one as well, as did Dennis Wilson. All 3 of them also had a passion for controlled substances and guns. Perhaps there is some connection there. Following his brief reunion with the Byrds, Clark composed the original score for Marijuana, a short anti-drug film hosted by Sonny Bono. His next project, dubbed The Fantastic Expedition of Dillard and Clark, featured Gene, Doug Dillard, formerly of the Dillades, from whom Buffer Low Springfield, it will be recalled, had obtained their instruments. Bernie Ledon, who had been a peripheral member of San Diego's Scottsville Squirrelbarkers, alongside Chris Hillman, and of course, Chris Hillman. By that time Gene had married, and his wife, Carly, was an avid reader of occult literature, particularly, as she recalled, this lady named Madame Blavatsky. Circa 1971, Clark was approached by his friend and fellow Canyonite, Dennis Hopper, to compose songs for the soundtrack. WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON 196. To Hopper's American Dreamer. Around that same time, according to Einarsson, Gene's running buddies included David Carradine and John Barrymore. That was, to say the least, a rather curious group of friends. According to authors such as Craig Heimbichner, Martin P. Starr, and John Carter, Dennis Hopper and John Carradine, David's dad, were both members of the infamous Agape Lodge of the OTO, alongside doomed rocket scientist Jack Parsons, actor Dean Stockwell, and doppelgangers L. Ron Hubbard and Robert Heinlein. According to Gregory Mank, writing in Hollywood's Hellfire Club, John Carradine and John Barrymore were also members of the so-called Bundy Drive Boys, a group that engaged in such practices as incest, rape and cannibalism. And according to Ed Sanders, among the upscale homes visited by a process work group was the John Barrymore Mansion, located at 1301 Summit Ridge Drive. The year 1972 saw yet another brief Byrds reunion with another record released, this one in February of 1973. Gene next began recording sessions for a new solo project, financed by his friend Gary Legon, the husband of porn star and Ivory soap model Marilyn Chambers. Joining Gene on some of the tracks was Emmylou Harris, whose hubby Tom Slocum, a descendant of famed explorer Joshua Slocum, was a member of Gene's inner circle. After briefly relocating to Albion, California with his wife and kids, Clark moved back to Laurel Canyon, where he moved into a home on Stanley Hills Drive with his new girlfriend, Terry Messina. Born into considerable wealth, Messina was the daughter of a prominent area Phi Sikian. In 1963, she had enrolled in theatre arts at UCLA, which quite likely would have placed her in the company of a couple of other UCLA theatre arts students named Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek. Terry and Gene moved in together in the summer of 1977. According to Einarsson, Messina latterly worked in film editing, but she was better known in exclusive circles as a supplier of cocaine and heroin. As has been previously discussed, during that time period the entire Laurel Canyon lifestyle revolved around cocaine, and Gene fell into line, becoming a legendary partier. Canyon resident Ken Mansfield recalled those dark years. That particular point in my life, and most of us, was the craziest time of all, when we were all into drugs the most. Tommy's house was one of the David M. C. Gowan 197 houses we hung out at a lot. David Carradine was my neighbor in Laurel Canyon. Our two properties were side by side. David had a group called Water. I could tell you some wild canyon stories. Looking back, it's not a nice memory. Even though we thought we were having a good time, I don't think we really were. Shortly after Tommy K's little girl, Eloise, died in an unfortunate accident, it just seemed like everybody's life got dark, and we all kind of lost hope there for a while. Kids living in Laurel Canyon apparently had to be particularly vigilant about avoiding tragic accidents. Circa 1978, Clark teamed with former bandmates Hillman and McGinn for a contrived reunion tour. An album followed in early 1979, with a second released in early 1980. During that time, according to brother David Clark, Gene was hanging around with these really gross characters, who were just a bunch of burnouts, and he wasn't much bet. Kathy Evelyn Smith was there. Not long after, Smith would attain a certain amount of notoriety for her involvement in the curious death of John Belushi at the Chateau Marmorne. We should then, I suppose, add John Belushi to the Laurel Canyon death list. And Eloise Kay as well. Following the release of the second Byrds reunion album, Clark and a close friend, guitarist Jesse Ed Davis, left LA for Oahu, Hawaii, supposedly to get clean. They returned at the end of 1981, with Gene once again settling into his favorite canyon. Among his close friends at that time were former child star Kurt Russell and his then-wife, actress Cezanne Hubley, who had also taken up residence in Laurel Canyon. Gene's solo career sputtered on for another decade, though fewer and fewer people seemed to be paying much attention. In January 1991, the original members of the Byrds came together for their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Clark died just 4 months later, reportedly of a heart attack. He was just 46 at the time. The circumstances of his death remain murky to this day. As Einarsson has noted, what transpired over the last 3 days of Gene's life remains clouded by controversy, conspiracy theories abound, accusations have been leveled. For the most part though, Gene has now been all but forgotten. His vast stockpile of unreleased material, however, much of which mysteriously disappeared after his death, likely lives on, albeit credited to others. According to Einarsson, Clark had been fighting to stay sober but it WERDSCENSINSIDETHECANYON 198 is agreed that he began drinking again on the evening of Wednesday, May 22. What happened next depends entirely on who is telling the story. One witness who claims he searched the house for drugs and did not find any, contrary to claims by others that drugs and drug paraphernalia were present in the house. There are those conspiracy theorists who continue to insinuate that drugs and certain characters were, indeed, present that night, and that Gene's death was a result of misadventure, necessitating a panicked cleanup campaign that morning. There were apparently numerous people present at Clark's home on the morning of May 24, 1991, as Gene lay dead on the living room floor. One of those people was Saul Davis, who took it upon himself to contact the media with the news, another bone of contention with some, given that Saul was not serving as Gene's manager at the time. Another was the manager of the property, identified as Ray Berry, who had served during World War II in Special Ops. While people milled about the house, arguing over the spoils, Gene's body continued to lie on the living room floor, face up. Days later, David Carradine caused quite a stir at Gene's open casket memorial service. Former bandmate Pat Robinson remembered it well. When Carradine came up, he wasn't as much drunk as he was on acid, I think, and his girlfriend and business manager at the time was there with him. And we're standing there and Carradine says, "You cocksucker," and grabs Gene by the lapels. When you pull somebody up from a coffin and they have nothing inside for guts, they bend high up. It was really shocking to see that. And Carradine goes, "You pissed on my daughter when she was 13. And he said it pretty loud and then he says, "I saw him snicker, boys, heh." Oh man, that was weird. Perhaps weirder still is that many of those who were in attendance remember hearing something a little different. "You fucked my daughter when she was 13. Maybe Carradine had mistaken Clark for Roman Polanski. Or maybe that's just what everyone was doing in Laurel Canyon. In any event, none of the original members of the Byrds bothered to attend the service. Afterwards, Gene was laid to rest in tiny Tipton. It should be noted here, before concluding this chapter, that there were very clear indications that Gene Clark suffered from a rather severe dissociative disorder throughout his adult life. As far as can be David M. C. Gowan. 199. Termined from the literature, he was never diagnosed as such, but comments made by his bandmates and family members are quite revealing. One such bandmate, Pat Robinson, has described how Clark used to slip into these dream states, which I thought was really amazing. He'd go into these dream states and lay down on the couch and go, "I'll be right back, Patrick." Another, John York, has said that Gene had these multiple personalities. Yet another, Bernie Ledon, remembered that Clark would often appear to be completely out of it, and he'd say, "Hey, Gene, what are you thinking?" And he would go, "Huh?" Oh, like he was being brought back to reality. Gene's sister, Bonnie Clark, has also noted that there was more than one version of the troubled singer-songwriter. There was this persona, and the rest of Gene was somewhere in there. He was hard to get to know. He could be very warm and loving, but that could change in a heartbeat. Chronicler John Arson offered the following summation. It is often difficult for those who knew him, even family members, to reconcile the two Gene Clarks, the cheerful, engaging yet shy loner with the vibrant imagination, and the frustrated, moody recluse who was sometimes prone to violence.